You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
What if I told you that behind the peaceful smile and gentle demeanor of George Harrison, there burned a quiet anger that lasted his entire life? What if the man we knew as the spiritual Beatle, the one who brought Eastern philosophy to Western music, actually carried a grudge so deep that it changed how he saw friendship forever? Today, we're diving into the untold story of why George Harrison couldn't stand one particular person, and how that hatred shaped not just his music, but his entire existence. Most people think of George Harrison as the calm, quiet member of the Beatles. He was the one who found peace through meditation, who wrote beautiful songs about love and spirituality, and who seemed to float above all the drama that tore the band apart. But that image couldn't be further from the truth. Behind those kind eyes was a man who felt deeply hurt, constantly overlooked, and eventually deeply angry at someone he once called a friend. The story begins in Liverpool in the late 1950s. George Harrison was just 15 years old when he joined what would become the most famous band in history. Picture this: a teenage boy, guitar in hand, riding a school bus and dreaming of rock and roll stardom. He was young, impressionable, and completely in awe of the older boys who had already started making music together. John Lennon was the leader, sharp and brilliant, while Paul McCartney was confident and driven. George looked up to both of them like they were his heroes. When George auditioned for the band that would later become the Beatles, he was so nervous he could barely play. But something magical happened on that bus ride when he played a guitar line that impressed John Lennon enough to let him join. From that moment, George Harrison stepped into what would become the biggest musical story of the 20th century. But he was stepping into someone else's story, and besides it, he would spend the next decade feeling like an outsider in his own band. In those early days, George was happy just to be included. He was the youngest, the quietest, and he knew his place. While John and Paul wrote the songs that would make them famous, George learned, practiced, and waited for his chance to contribute. The press called him the Quiet Beatle, and for a while, that nickname seemed to fit perfectly. He wasn't trying to grab attention or fight for the spotlight. He was content to be part of something incredible. But as the years went by and the Beatles became the most famous band in the world, something started to change inside George Harrison. He began to realize that being quiet didn't mean he didn't have anything to say. He had musical ideas bubbling up inside him. He had songs he wanted to share with the world. He had guitar parts that could make their music even better. The problem was, whenever he tried to speak up, he was either ignored or shut down. The person who shut him down the most was Paul McCartney. Now, Paul wasn't trying to be mean or cruel. He was just a perfectionist who had very specific ideas about how their music should sound. But to George, Paul's perfectionism felt like a prison. Every time George suggested a guitar part, Paul would change it. Every time George brought in a song idea, Paul would explain why it wouldn't work. Slowly but surely, Paul was crushing George's confidence without even realizing it. George later said something that breaks your heart when you really think about it. He said that Paul ruined me as a guitar player. Imagine being one of the most talented guitarists in the world and feeling like you're not good enough because someone keeps telling you how to play. That's exactly what happened to George Harrison. Day after day, year after year, Paul would micromanage every note George played until George started to doubt his own abilities. The worst part was that Paul thought he was helping. He believed that by controlling every detail, he was making the Beatles better. And maybe he was right about the music, but he was destroying George's spirit in the process. George began to feel like he wasn't a real member of the band. He felt like he was just someone who played whatever Paul and John told him to play. As the Beatles evolved from a simple rock band into something much more complex, George began to find his own voice through Eastern music and spirituality. He discovered the sitar. He studied with Indian masters, and he began to write songs that were completely different from anything John and Paul were creating. This should have been an exciting time for the band. They could have embraced George's new ideas and created even more innovative music. Instead, Paul seemed threatened by George's growth. When George would bring in songs influenced by Indian music, Paul would dismiss them as weird or uncommercial. When George wanted to explore new sounds and instruments, Paul would steer the band back toward more traditional rock and roll. It was like Paul couldn't stand the idea that George might have something valuable to contribute. The breaking point came during the recording of their later albums. By 1968, when they were working on the White Album, George was no longer willing to sit quietly and let Paul run everything. He had grown as a songwriter. He had confidence in his abilities, and he was tired of being treated like a sidekick. But instead of supporting George's development, Paul seemed to push back even harder. The most painful moment came during the filming of Let It Be in 1969. The cameras were rolling as the Beatles tried to rehearse, but what they captured wasn't a band working together. It was a band falling apart. Paul was trying to direct George's guitar playing on a song, telling him exactly what to play and how to play it. Finally, George had enough. In a moment that was caught on tape, George told Paul, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." The words were calm, but the message was clear. George was done being controlled. He was done being treated like he didn't matter. He was telling Paul, in the nicest way possible, that he'd rather quit than continue being disrespected. And that's exactly what happened. On January 10th, 1969, George Harrison quit the Beatles, just walked away from the biggest band in the world because he couldn't stand being dominated by Paul McCartney anymore. The other band members were shocked. The press went crazy, but George didn't care. He had finally reached his breaking point. Of course, George came back to the band a few days later, but something had changed forever. The trust was broken. The friendship was damaged. George returned under new conditions that gave him more creative control. And during this time, he wrote some of his most beautiful songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun. These masterpieces proved what George was capable of when he was simply left alone to create. But the damage between George and Paul couldn't be undone. Even though they continued working together until the Beatles broke up in 1970, their relationship never recovered. George had learned that Paul would always see him as the little brother who needed guidance, never as an equal partner who deserved respect. When the Beatles finally broke up, George felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in years. While John and Paul fought publicly over who was to blame for the breakup, George quietly began building his own life and career. But the anger toward Paul never went away. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger as time passed. George's solo career became a way for him to express all the frustration he had kept bottled up during his Beatles years. His first solo album, All Things Must Pass, was filled with songs that had been rejected by the band. It was like George was saying, "Here's all the music you thought wasn't good enough." The album was a huge success, proving that George had been right all along about his abilities. One song on the album, called Wah Wah, was particularly pointed. On the surface, it sounded like a fun, upbeat song, but the lyrics were actually about the headaches and frustration George had endured in the Beatles. Many people believed it was a direct attack on Paul's controlling behavior, and George never denied it. Even George's ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, noticed how much George disliked Paul. She said that George would come home from recording sessions angry and frustrated, especially after dealing with Paul. According to Pattie, George and Paul tolerated each other, but never really loved each other as friends. She could see that George carried this resentment with him even when he was supposed to be relaxing at home. The bitterness went so deep that George said he would be happy to work with John Lennon again, but never with Paul. He called Paul a bit overpowering and made it clear that he had no interest in being controlled again. This wasn't just about music anymore. This was about respect, dignity, and the right to be heard. What made George's anger even more painful was that Paul never seemed to understand what he had done wrong. Paul thought he was being helpful and professional, but he couldn't see how his behavior had hurt someone he claimed to care about. This lack of awareness made George feel even more invisible and unimportant. Years passed, and both George and Paul built successful solo careers. They would occasionally cross paths at industry events or award shows, and they were always polite to each other in public. But anyone who knew them well could see that the warmth between them was gone. They had become strangers who shared an incredible history, but no real friendship. In 1994, the surviving Beatles reunited to work on the Anthology project, completing some unfinished John Lennon recordings. Fans around the world were excited to see their heroes back together, but the reunion wasn't the healing experience everyone hoped it would be. The old patterns returned immediately. Paul still tried to control everything, and George still bristled under that control. When asked how it felt to be back in the studio with Paul, George gave a telling answer. He said it was like going back to school. Think about what that means. School is where you're told what to do, where your creativity is limited, where you have to ask permission to express yourself. That's exactly how George felt working with Paul, even after all those years. The producer who worked on those sessions noticed that George would roll his eyes whenever Paul got too controlling. Even Paul admitted later that they got on each other's nerves during the reunion. Time had passed, but the fundamental problem between them hadn't changed. Paul was still Paul, and George was still tired of being managed. As George entered his final years, he retreated more and more from the public eye. He focused on his family, his spiritual practice, and his private life. When he was diagnosed with cancer in 1997, he faced his illness with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his life. But even then, the complicated feelings about Paul remained. In one of his last public appearances, an online chat in 2001, someone asked George if Paul still annoyed him. Instead of giving a direct answer, George quoted an old saying, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. Why, I'll know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was a diplomatic way of saying that yes, Paul still bothered him, but George had learned to accept it. When George was dying, Paul came to visit him. According to Paul, they sat together holding hands and talking about old times. Paul later said that George was like a baby brother to him, and that their final conversation was peaceful and loving. But we only have Paul's version of what happened in that room. We don't know what George was really thinking or feeling. George Harisson died on November 29, 2001, surrounded by his family. His last words were reportedly, "Love one another," which sounds exactly like something the spiritual, peaceful George would say. But throughout his life, George had struggled to love Paul McCartney. He had tried to forgive, tried to move past the hurt, but the wound was too deep. The truth is that some relationships can't be fixed, no matter how much time passes or how much we want them to heal. George Harisson spent decades carrying the pain of feeling invisible, unheard, and disrespected by someone he once looked up to. That pain shaped his music, his worldview, and his relationships with other people. George Harisson didn't hate Paul McCartney because Paul was evil or cruel. He hated him because Paul had the power to lift him up, but chose to hold him down instead. Paul had the opportunity to be a true friend and partner, but instead became the person who made George question his own worth. That kind of hurt doesn't go away with time. It just gets quieter. Looking back at George Harrison's life, we see a man who found peace in spirituality, joy in music, and love in his family. But we also see someone who never quite got over the feeling that he wasn't good enough, smart enough, or important enough to stand as an equal next to Paul McCartney. That's the tragedy of George Harrison's story. He was incredibly talented, deeply spiritual, and genuinely kind, but he spent too many years feeling like he didn't matter. The next time you listen to a Beatles song, remember that behind the harmony and the joy, there was also pain, frustration, and unresolved anger. Remember that George Harisson, the quiet Beatle, had a voice that deserved to be heard, and dreams that deserved to be respected. And remember that sometimes, the people who hurt us the most are the ones who never meant to hurt us at all. George Harrison's hatred for Paul McCartney wasn't about jealousy or competition. It was about dignity, respect, and the basic human need to be seen and valued. In the end, George found his peace, but he found it by walking away from the person who had made him feel small. Sometimes, That's the only choice we have. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the relationships in your own life, then hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a friendship that was damaged by someone who thought they were helping you? Have you ever felt invisible in a group where you deserve to be heard? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories about the music and musicians that shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.